Hello, and welcome to the Glasgow University History Society podcast. I'm El Principe himself, Nathan McLennan. And joining me today are...
Callum Ferguson.
John Hill.
And Robbie Patterson.
And today we are delving into the mind and the world of Niccolo Machiavelli. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is safer to be feared than loved. These were the words of 16th century Italian philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli. From Democrats to totalitarians, from business to politics and everything in between, we all use his playbook. Machiavelli is a towering figure of political philosophy. Admired and despised in equal measure, he is one of the most astute observers of human nature. His ideas, unique among philosophers of the time, were the product of decades of political experience in the government of the Republic of Florence. His image of human beings, though rarely flattering, was always honest, and today we examine in brief Machiavelli's ideas and the political world which shaped them. Now, to start with, we need to look at his most famous work, Il Principe, The Prince. And to begin to consider his philosophy, we must ask the question, what does Machiavelli say about human nature?
Well, I suppose I'll begin by saying that Machiavelli took a bit of a dim view of human nature. And I'll confine my points with regards to this to the Prince. As that's the book I've read. Machiavelli regularly pointed out that men were motivated largely by self-interest, but also that they were quite ignorant of virtue. One of the most significant points, I think, about human nature that Machiavelli made in The Prince is in chapter 17. And it is... And when he, the Prince, is obliged to take the life of anyone, let him do so when he has a proper justification and manifest reason for it. But above all, he must abstain from taking the property of others. For men forget more easily the death of their father than they do the loss of their patrimony, which means inheritance. So in short, the latter part of that point is kind of a criticism of human nature. It's suggesting that we're all inherently selfish. We care more about property, land, wealth, etc., than we do about human or animal life. I'd argue that even today, there are quite a lot of people who are very satisfied in society with other people suffering and dying just so they can maintain their wealth. And I think that you could say it was a criticism. You could say that Machiavelli was being horribly misanthropic, but you could also argue that it's a sort of accurate reflection of at least what his society was like.
It's worth noting that the society of Machiavelli is the height of the Italian Renaissance, when classical learning and texts were once again becoming much more prevalent and much more discussed. So when it comes to the confiscation of property, that can be seen in the infamous prescriptions of both Republican Romans and Roman emperors, who the public of Italy, well, the educated elite of Italy, rather, were looking up to at the time. So if you look to Republican dictators like Sulla, one of the most infamous acts of their reign were the prescriptions, where a list of wealthy opponents to the state were drawn up, they were killed, and their property was confiscated. Now, as a learned man, I posit that Machiavelli is in part taking this stance against confiscating the property of the population because he has seen what that does historically to a state once it starts confiscating property, and the enmity that earns the ruler.
Yeah, so I suppose in that sense, he sort of depicts human nature as definitely self-seeking, and sort of. I think that there's also a quote in the Prince that says, where he says,
"For men forget more easily the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony," which, as I said, is just their inheritance. It's basically, if you take, I mean, the part of it that follows on is that then also pretexts for the seizure of property are never wanting, and one who begins to live by rapine will always find some reason for taking the goods of others, whereas the causes for taking life are rarer and more fleeting. Basically suggesting the argument is once you get started being selfish as a prince, it's very easy to continue being well, in this case, rapine, rapacious and destructive.
Yeah.
But killing someone is actually a harder thing to do and is done less regularly, even though really there is less value placed on human life. As in, so much value is placed on property that men are quite greedy over that than they are over actual human life.
It's something that's remained a moral constant to this day in many cases.
Yes, I mean, how often have people today thought about this, what they stand to gain from the death of a loved one? When whoever has had a thud in the house of an elderly relative has started thinking about who's getting the silverware.
Have you been on the Dostoyevsky again, Callum?
I have never read anything by a Russian. Actually, that's not true. I've read Kropotkin. I've never read any classical Russian literature, so I'll just have to take your word for it.
That's a good point that you mentioned Dostoyevsky. I know it's like a sort of by and by point, but so reading The Prince, there was a sort of idea that came up that I've read in Crime and Punishment by Dostoyevsky, that in his novel, he conceives of the idea that there is a type of people who are very individual, and so much so that they seek their own lot in life, that they attain power and wealth by obstructing and transgressing the status quo and laws to replace these laws with their own ideas. And men such men include Napoleon, and I think it's this very individualized concept that Machiavelli seems to evoke, especially regarding Cesare Borgia, the Pope's son.
Which is a fascinating bit of history all in itself, because to give some context, the Pope Alexander VI was a member of the House of Borgia, which originates from I believe it was a Spanish town of Borgia, and they gained significant influence in the church, becoming elected Pope in the case of Alexander VI, and in the cases of other members of the family like Lucrezio and I believe Cesare for a while before he became a condottiere, they gained significant power within the church. And they used this to sort of carve out a state in central Italy and vastly expand the physical, well, temporal power of the papal state.
I was going to say, I have to say, I'm not particularly familiar with this period in history, or at least what I do know about this period of history is largely derived from The Prince.
A very authoritative time period.
Yeah. To be honest, you can learn a lot from just reading The Prince about what Machiavelli, specifically what he thought about the time, as well as what was actually going on.
It can almost be compared to the letters of Cicero in a way, because he does provide this sort of authoritative text on writing on the time itself that we still use today as a major source for the period.
Machiavelli came up with the idea that there's a sucker born every minute. In chapter 18 of The Prince, he said, "Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who are themselves willing to be deceived." That can be elaborated upon further later, but I really wanted to mention that part.
If we're adding things onto about the human nature point, there's one point. I thought it's worth mentioning. He writes that men do you harm either because they fear you or they hate you. So I think that in itself looks at the inner psyche of power relations and motives towards human nature. So I think it shows that men are quite revenging.
If we're throwing more petrol on the bonfire, which is an expression that Girolamo Savonarola probably wouldn't be a big fan of, but the construction of Machiavelli's morality with regards to the state seems to be, in the case of principalities and more authoritarian regimes, is that you need to be a strong ruler and disregard the morality of the day because it will interfere with the governing of politics. Essentially, it's the whole zero-sum game idea in international relations. If you act in a conventionally moral way towards another state or perhaps even your own people, they will take advantage of that and they can then act against you. Essentially, if you're not the most ruthless bastard imaginable, someone else will be the most ruthless bastard imaginable and attempt to undermine you and undo your state. And if they're going to be more cruel than you, then it's best to be a little cruel to prevent the rise of someone more tyrannical and someone who doesn't mean good for the people. Essentially, he's trying to be good to the people by making sure they live under a stable, strong regime rather than, say, giving them a say in government, at least in the Prince.
I think even then, with all the cynicism that we've kind of evoked from the Prince, it should be bear in mind that this is all very tempered with a certain amount of liberality and providing good opportunities for the societies that are conquered. So, like, for example, with Cesare Borgia, on top of executing his leading man that was leading this newly conquered territory in central Italy, he also invested in the city. He developed theatres and things for public benefit, which not only diverts attention from dissent, but also acquires the minds and hearts. Another example in this sort of period would be Cosimo de' Medici in Florence itself, probably earlier on in the Renaissance, because he invested in building the dome of the famous Florentine cathedral.
Yes, the Duomo.
Yeah.
So now we've had our taste of Machiavelli, pessimistic perhaps, but always pragmatic. So we now must ask, how does this view of human nature relate to political behaviour?
Well, as I was arguing about man's ignorance in Machiavelli's mind, I think it's important to point out that Machiavelli was somewhat liberal in his understanding of the relationship of human society to politics. Human nature, or at least Machiavelli's view of human nature, I think is the basis of what we now call Machiavellianism, that idea of being sneaky and duplicitous and scheming. Now, I'll later make an argument that says that that's not actually what Machiavellianism is, but certainly describing someone as Machiavellian often carries that connotation, which one can derive from his view of human nature. But when you actually view it as his thoughts were on political behaviour, I think there's a compelling argument against Machiavelli's argument. And I know we're not really going to talk about the discourses, but anyone who has read the discourses, I encourage everyone to try and read them. They're a bit longer than the Prince, but he goes into a much, much different area of human society. He talks about republics, because Machiavelli was a Republican. And his view of political behaviour in that is significantly different from the Prince. Specifically, Machiavelli argued that a trickster could take advantage of most people because most people are able to be taken advantage of. But he doesn't actually argue that it's necessarily in the interest of the Prince to trick his people just because they can be tricked. If one pragmatically has to mislead the people in order to benefit them or maintain the power of the Prince, or both, then the Prince shouldn't hesitate. But at the same time, the Prince shouldn't necessarily manipulate his people unless he has to. And I'd say that comes into political behaviour in chapter 5 of The Prince, because he talks about how taking land and property from people and manipulating the people is something that any prince taking over a new land should avoid. He says, when those states which have been acquired or accustomed to live at liberty under their own laws, there are 3 ways of holding them. The first is to despoil them. The second is to go and live there in person. The third is to allow them to live under their own laws. What is more, a city used to liberty can be easily held by means of its citizens than in any other way. And what I think Machiavelli is trying to argue here very quickly is that people are naturally self-interested, naturally ignorant, naturally pretty sort of useless as political creatures. But a wise ruler will look out for the self-interests of his peoples and will understand, and I suppose you could say act as a political scientist and analyse the makeup of the people that they rule over and act in a way that is most beneficial for the state and the people.
Yeah.
Or at least that's my argument.
Yeah, I agree with that. You also mentioned a brief point in there about when you quoted Machiavelli about having the prince live amongst the newly conquered territories that he's gained, at least for a time. And I think this idea sort of even forms and shapes the sort of modern politician. This that you have to sort of be an appealing person to the people, so you have to almost deliver yourself as one of them. So like a politician going to a pub, having a pint, that sort of thing, it sort of shapes the modern politician in that way. And I think, yeah, that adds to its sort of duplicity and two-facedness in a way.
Yes, but at the same time, Machiavelli wasn't arguing necessarily that the politician or the prince or the political leader should necessarily be duplicitous. Only do it if it's actually necessary for the actual best interests of the people. A politician going into the pub and pulling a pint in order to appear like one of us does not actually benefit the people. There are many successful politicians in the present who have never done such publicity stunts.
It's more like in the interest of the prince himself, in these newly acquired territories, to sort of cement your presence there. You have to go about.
Which is, I suppose, that was the second option, the going to live there in person.
Another method, if I may interject, that Machiavelli suggests is the colonization of a newly conquered territory with your own people, because they will innately be easy to control. They will be indebted to you because they now own property in an area and have gained property as a result of your conquests. So that's the other way you can cement control over a newly conquered territory, is cement it with garrisoned bastions of loyal men who will be able to see off any uprising by the native population, which is a strategy that's been used many times throughout history in order to subdue a population, is to put a small power of another group that is loyal to the government in charge. It can even be seen in, to choose something slightly controversial, Ireland under Britain.
Sort of coming back to the idea that the political side of Machiavelli, that he often there's a running conceit that the prince should favour opportunity over fortune. So to elevate your position, you have to do it through opportunism. So, for example, he gives a really good example in the Italian War of 1494 to 1494 to 1498, where Charles VIII comes to Italy to help secure the papacy in central Italy, and he argues that the papacy is quite unstable and sort of goes against the French once they've solidified their presence in Italy by forming the Holy League with the other northern Italian states, with Florence, Venice, Milan, etc. So I think that's another point to make about the political side of it.
So now that we've considered Machiavelli's thoughts on human political behaviour, it's worth asking, among the more pertinent questions about his philosophy, is Machiavelli an immoral philosopher, or is he rather an amoral philosopher? Thoughts?
He's definitely innovative. I think in regards to the church at the time, if we're talking about morality, I think he obviously really deviates from it. And I would argue he's an amoral philosopher, because when he talks about Savonarola, who was a Dominican friar who ruled the Republic of Florence just after the Medici were exiled upon Charles VIII's entry into Italy, he sort of depicts the idea that nice people aren't cut out for politics or for governance, and in this sense, for this reason, they can't really morally adapt to the deadly political realities of life. Ironically, the Pope Alexander VI did as a Borgia. So he actually captured, tortured, and executed Savonarola in the Florence in public square. So that's sort of goes to show how niceness is sort of subdued to the realities of the world. And I think this comes back to the idea that he takes away morality from effectiveness, that he adapts and recognizes the world as it is rather than a world that we wish for. So this is a sort of self-evident truth that's often overlooked, it seems, especially in the years after, in the centuries after the Prince. It's not until Spinoza talks about how Machiavelli sort of sheds light on this, actually. I think he mentions him at one point. But yeah, what do you guys think?
I think I wholeheartedly agree with you in that Machiavelli is an amoral philosopher rather than an immoral philosopher, because he doesn't say that being a bastard is a good thing, be a complete and utter arsehole to your own people. He's more about people are it's almost Hobbesian. People are by their nature necessarily cruel and self-centered, and so if you want to make sure, if you have the ideal that you want people to thrive, and you want people to be under a stable government, and bear in mind that this is a time in which Italy is a catastrophically unstable place, very regular wars, lots of small divided polities, then you have to be the strongest of the bunch. You have to rein the bastards in by being a bit of a bastard yourself. So it's sort of taking apart the socially constructed morality of the day, because it interferes with the pragmatism that's necessary to be a ruler. You have to be willing to be a bit of a bastard in order to make sure that your realm's stable and that your people will thrive. So what you need is strong, efficient, and morally unencumbered leadership. So the state is unsusceptible to political manipulation. And it's a pioneer of international relations theory in a way, because it enshrines this idea of classical realism, as it's called in IR theory. Basically the idea that states are by their nature self-centered. War is a legitimate continuation of political theory. States are going to act in their own interests. Alliances can't really be trusted with other states because they're only going to be an alliance for as long as it's mutually convenient for all parties, which is enshrined in the example of the Holy League. So Machiavelli, I'd say, is amoral because if you're constrained by conventional morality, other people who aren't constrained by conventional morality and who are potentially crueler than you will take hold and drive the state into the ground through their own selfish ambition. Whereas he invites a prince, and this was written to the Medici of Florence, he invites the prince to take hold of the state of the day and run it in a ruthless manner, in such a way that the people will have stable governance and be well defended against foreign incursions and threats. Essentially, be as ruthless as you need to be to ensure your state thrives and that your population does well.
That's true, yeah. You make a good point about sort of separating morality from secular politics, because it seems that Machiavelli points out that the Western perspective in following the Christian steps of Jesus of Nazareth was not only sentimental but ineffective, because from a practical perspective, Jesus' life, I hope I don't sound heretical, but it was an outright disaster. If you think
Burn
about
him
it,
at the stake! Burn him at the stake!
It just reminds me of Monty Python.
Did Machiavelli weigh more than a duck?
Surprisingly, probably.
He wasn't exactly. He was my introduction to the discourse, the Princeton discourses, actually refers to him as his portraits show a thin-faced, pale man with sharp nose, sunken cheeks, subtle lips, and a discreet the enigmatic smile with piercing black eyes that look as if they knew much more than they were ever willing to tell.
That sort of reads as Machiavelli fan fiction.
Yeah, my copy was written in 1940, and so I suppose I get a sort of pre-revisionist historiographical view of Machiavelli, and it even comes out in the translation. Probably from the quotes you'll be reading, you can tell I'm reading an older edition. Because I just think the language of such editions are much better. I don't really have anything else to add other than Machiavelli was completely unconcerned about the conventional morality of the day because he believed it limited the political actions of state actors. And with regards to the classic realism argument, I say that fits in well. I mean, politics and war are inherently the same thing. Helmut von Moltke, the Elder's maxim that war is the
continuation of
politics by other means works just as easily the other way. Politics is the continuation of war by other means, whether that war be a social war in both the literal Roman sense and in a sort of more abstract class sense, or whether it's an actual conflict between two sovereign states. The political machinations that surround such a conflict will always continue to pursue them in whatever theatre is most practical at the time, whether that be in courtrooms and diplomatic houses, or whether it's actually on the battlefield. And for that, Machiavelli clearly realised that from a very rational political perspective, it was impossible to realistically pursue a successful state and to be a moral actor. So he would never have advocated being immoral without justifiable reason.
There needs to always be like a reason behind the bastardy. You can't just be a dick and expect to get away with it.
Yes, and an analysis, it seems, of late 15th and early 16th century Italian politics shows there was a lot of bastards around. But
especially those of Alexander VI.
Yeah, definitely. As the
Pope. yes, the Pope. He was the Borgia Pope, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was.
Who sired literal and metaphorical bastards.
Well, he sired Cesare Borgia, who in every possible sense of the word was a bastard.
This is a really good point, actually. The character of Alexander VI as Pope. Machiavelli also brings up the idea of difficult decisions, as he says in The Prince, also known as being ethical trade-offs. So it means that you can't be one thing whilst being superior at another thing. It's paradoxical. So, for example, one example is being a good businessman at the same time that has a cost of not being a very good husband or father. In the case of Alexander VI, Borgia, the Borgia Pope, he is he's trying to combine being Pope whilst being a political player. And it just doesn't work out, does it? And as we've already mentioned about Savonarola and him, it's two different characters and two different moralities being pursued. So, as Callum has said already, it's just a total lack of concern for morality in the political game.
That's the first time I have ever heard the actions of Pope Alexander, as any kind of type of morality.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, we're not going to go into it, of course, but I'll say two words: Vatican orgies.
Like, Pope Alexander VI's life reminds me of a joke a very dear friend told me once. He said, well, you know, I operate on what I like to call moral relativism, but some people call an organ harvesting operation. Like, he just did not give a shit. It's a wonderful thing about the Borgia popes is that if they were any other sort of king or Really, they would have easily gotten away with what they were doing and conquered Italy. And even then, they nearly did. But it's the fact that he has the temerity, as Pope of the Catholic faith, to hold orgies in the Vatican itself.
Being God's sole representative on earth does give one the advantage of not having to worry about excommunication.
Yeah. Like,
However, I think that the excesses of not only aristocrats and popes and other potentates of that period, well, I imagine that Machiavelli probably viewed them somewhat as amateurs who really didn't actually understand how to run their own states. It's just that, well, they had all the power, and so they weren't going to listen to a weedy little bureaucrat.
Mm.
And I think what ended up happening with regards to that is that Machiavelli eventually, people like Machiavelli were turned on by this hypocritical, aristocratic and political elite of that part of Europe. I'll get onto this a bit later, but I do think that a lot of our views of Machiavelli are actually coloured by the reactions of these very self-same bastards when they first came across the prince.
Yeah, because they tried to disguise the bastardy, obfuscate the bastardy.
And the entire genre which Machiavelli was writing in the Mirror for Princes genre, I'd argue that the Prince itself is a damning criticism of that genre. People describe it as a satire, and you could argue that in some ways it's the most practically effective satire ever written.
That's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah, because throughout the entire book, he's sort of demonstrating that in an absolutist regime, how much of a cunt you have to be to retain power, and how difficult it is to make sure people are safe and prosperous under your rule. And since you've monopolized all power in yourself and potentially a few advisors, you need to be constantly on the lookout for everyone betraying you and trying to gain this position of absolute power. But since Machiavelli himself was an ardent Republican, he was very much in favor of the reverse of that, diverse political absolutism, not having the totality of the state centered in one man or one group of men.
Well, yes, Machiavelli was a Republican. Actually, another point is he was a Renaissance humanist. I mean, I don't know whether he was. Obviously, no one actually knows because he would never publicly admit it. But I would not be surprised if Machiavelli was not actually himself a Christian.
Yeah, I can see that, because it was like he viewed sort of the Christianization of rulership, sort of the involvement of religion in politics, and not necessarily
fundamentally against the concept of the meek shall inherit the earth.
Oh yeah, he sort of saw through that convenient lie.
I wouldn't describe it as a convenient lie, but fair enough.
Well, speaking of Machiavelli's personal qualities, here's an interesting point for you all. How Machiavellian was Machiavelli?
Not very.
In the sense that we use it today as a duplicitous, backstabbing Iago character from Shakespeare's Othello.
A Richard III murderous Machiavelli.
Yeah, he's definitely not Machiavellian. He really does temper the good and the evil. It's, as we've already said, it's just Christian morality is just, that's the issue that's not in concern here. It's just
Christian morality, arguably, is a very good moral code for an individual private citizen to follow. Yeah. But if one is a major political leader, and the thing is, one can, in a sense, separate one's personal morality from one's actions as a political leader. But when one is acting as a political leader, it's very difficult to maintain one's personal morality. I would say that, in fact, I've already said that our view of what Machiavellian is fundamentally wrong. That Machiavelli was not actually advocating that you have to be duplicitous and immoral, you're a scheming bastard. And although we've focused on the prince and not the discourses, I think we can still see that even in the prince, he's not a cold-heartedly pragmatic and callous as people have tried to portray him as. Now, can we call Machiavellianism an ideology is a question actually I've raised in my notes. Would you say that, and I'm not just talking about his practical advice in The Prince, but Machiavelli's views on the state and on ethics and politics in general. Could you describe Machiavellianism, or maybe Machiavellian republicanism, as a sort of a strand of classical ideology?
I would very much agree that it can be. I would say that as an ideology, it's found itself studied in modern day political science. For example, in classical and neoclassical realism, the two different types of this political philosophy and international relations that talks about how power, there's imbalances of power in the world stage are inherently a part of political reality, and that you can't necessarily be a moral actor on the international stage with regards to your alliances, because if you back a weaker power group, then you're going to be screwed over by a large one. The zero-sum game idea of politics. If you give an inch, then people will take a mile from you. So it's this idea of having to be ruthless to defend your people and to make sure that everyone under your admittedly ruthless and authoritarian rule will at least prosper. I'd argue it's quite outdated in the modern day, even though it can be followed as an ideology, because Machiavelli's conception of the Prince, as I see the Prince as sort of a guideline for authoritarian rule. I've not read the discourses, but I'm imagining that he advocates for something significantly different there. But as a sort of guideline for authoritarian rule and definitely political experience in international relations, the Prince, it undermines the idea of cooperation between states. The idea that cooperation between states is only for temporary political experience and convenience, and that long-lasting coalitions are essentially doomed to fail. And when you start believing that, it becomes a reality in and of itself, because you'll become inherently distrustful of other political organizations and states, because you'll assume they're thinking along these same lines. And even when a lasting coalition does come about, it can be easily undermined by this sort of Machiavellian conception that everyone's out for themselves, so I have to be out for myself and my people the most, so as to secure them from the other wolves.
It's an interesting point that you make, but perhaps in fear of sounding too Machiavellian, but isn't the idea, if when you're putting this place in the context of warring states in the Italian peninsula, you're just inherently distrustful as a human, don't you think? So rather than, as you said, put the perspective of distrust and then learning to be distrustful and then adopting it habitually, isn't it rather that we actually are distrustful people, humans? Don't you think? Well, that's an interesting question.
I wouldn't say that we were
one
naturally.
stage.
I would not actually argue that humans are naturally distrustful. It's just that we rely on our experiences to make judgments most of the time. And if one lives in a barbarous time, society reproduces itself. Individuals in a society are reproduced by that society. And barbarous times create barbarous people.
Yeah.
And Italy in the 15th century, it was a barbarous place.
Oh, absolutely. For all its touting of sort of Renaissance virtue, it was full of warfare and very, very grim goings on all around. Like the murder rate in Italy for the time was huge. And even though laws in earlier centuries have been taken against feuding, it's still very common to have families feuding against each other and having these sort of private conflicts intermesh with the state.
Actually, one thing I would say about the discourses with regards to this is that Machiavelli writes in chapter 4 of book 1 of the Discourses, very quickly, that the disunion of the Senate and the people of Rome rendered the Republic a powerful and free nation. And his argument, and this is an interesting one, that the derivation of liberty is not freedom from restraint. I'm getting into political philosophy a little bit here, but have you guys heard of Sir Isaiah Berlin, the 20th century liberal philosopher?
I'm not, I'm afraid.
And his lecture, Two Concepts of Liberty, Negative and Positive Liberty, Freedom from and Freedom to.
Oh, right, yeah, so positive and negative rights, almost.
Yes. Machiavelli, having lived 500 years earlier, didn't have this conception. He viewed freedom as not not a lack of interference, negative liberty.
Right, yeah.
He instead actually viewed it as negative domination, the inability of a group of people to oppress another group of people. One can only be free when one is able to live without the pressures of domination. That you can't be free. Total freedom is when no one can ever interfere with you, and you're never restrained by society. So Machiavelli made that argument. He also that led him to the argument that for a state to be at its most free, a republic would have to institutionalize class conflict. And he said that the rich and the poor must be constantly opposed to one another, and their interests must be balanced in the state. He's basically saying that the rich and the poor, or the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, if you will, should always remain politically opposed to each other in a balance of you could call it reciprocity or redress of grievance in the state. He thought that if you resolve class conflicts, then you remove some of the vital essence of the state. You remove the ability of the state to gain virtue. And that institutionalized conflict prevents the state from collapsing into a corrupted form. That's what I would argue is actual Machiavellianism. And obviously, Machiavelli himself wasn't actually like that. He didn't succeed in doing any of that within Florence or Italy in general. So you could say he wasn't Machiavellian in that respect. But that's a whole, this complex, class-based, classical Republican philosophy and his ideas of liberty are what I would argue is Machiavellian philosophy, not authoritarian rule. Machiavelli fundamentally believed in democracy, actually.
It's a fascinating argument, and I wholeheartedly
precisely
agree.
For that argument that the poor must be enfranchised to participate in the state, because otherwise they'll be dominated, and domination is unfreedom. And Machiavelli could not tolerate that in his philosophy. What I would finish by saying very quickly is that his arguments were a bridge between the classical view of political philosophy and the modern view of political science.
I agree
and
with that.
That's much, much more important than any chicanery he did in The Prince.
And I think one I'd just like to mention before we go on to, I think it's the context phase of the podcast next, but just before we go on to it, I just want to mention that The Prince itself is actually written in the Italian vernacular, not Latin. So I think that itself is very significant as well, because it alludes to the sort of secular nature of the work, and it just always comes back to this distance from Christian morality or morality generally. And yeah, I thought that would just be an extra point to add.
Okay, to wrap up, let's ask perhaps the most pertinent question of the whole podcast. Do we agree with Machiavelli? Take it in turns.
In some ways, I agree with Machiavelli. I think that we should always have a keen understanding of political science if we're ever going to actually be politicians. I think any politician should actually keenly understand and know the works of Machiavelli. Should they necessarily act on it? I'm less sure. But I think if someone is ever going to be any kind of political actor or commentator, they should be a bit Machiavellian in every sense of the word.
I generally agree with Machiavelli, although I think I hope I don't sound too Machiavelli, even more Machiavellian, to say that there are instances where total terror has worked. Not that I'm endorsing it, obviously, but if you're a sort of subhuman psychopath like Stalin, then terror seems to work wholly for you. And it depends. I think at that stage, though, you have to become a bit less human for it to happen. But I do generally, in regards to the Prince, I think I agree with it quite wholly. Yeah,
I'd say the arguments made in The Prince are fair for their day, although in the modern world, the idea of being very politically conniving and self-serving serves to undermine society and the international order rather than reinforce it and generally create a prosperous world. Especially when we're faced, because in the Italian Renaissance, they weren't necessarily facing the same issues as we do. They weren't necessarily dealing with issues like climate change, stuff that requires international cooperation at a very high level. So that's what I'd argue Machiavelli's ideals fell short, is when the context of the situation fundamentally changes, applying the ideals of the Prince definitely harm more than help.
Yeah, I suppose it comes back to what Callum said earlier, that barbarous times creates barbarous ideas. And yeah, that's a good point.
Absolutely.
I would say one last thing, and that is that the Prince should never be taken literally. Even at the time, it shouldn't have been taken literally. But I think that one can always interpret the word. Like any good piece of philosophy, it's universal.
And as the president of the society, of course I like Machiavelli. If I didn't, I wouldn't be where I am today. Right,
The previous president of the History Society has not yet been found. Please, if you have any location as to their whereabouts, dial the number listed in the description below.
Right, well, that about wrap. The next podcast episode that we'll be doing will be a collaboration, so very exciting. Stay tuned for that. I've been Nathan McLaren.
I've been Callum Fergus.
I'm John Hill.
And I'm Robbie Patterson.
Goodbye, everyone.